I stood there, right in the middle of the Grand Solaris Hotel's extravagant entrance, tugging at the sleeves of my plain blue suit. The fabric brushed against my wrists, a little rough, a little worn, but it was mine. It wasn't anything flashy, not like the polished tuxedos and shimmering gowns floating effortlessly around me, but it was clean, and that was enough. Today was Belle's wedding, my little girl's big day. I'd poured my heart, soul, and every last dime into her over the years. Paid her college tuition, sat through every dance recital she begged me to watch, and stayed up late, listening while she poured out her worries. But this wedding? I hadn't chosen a single flower or sampled a single slice of cake. That was all handled by the Thompsons, her fiancé's family, dripping with money and class. The marble floor gleamed under my scuffed shoes, and the chandeliers overhead sparkled like they were mocking me. I took a deep breath, trying to shake the uneasy knot twisting tighter in my stomach. Then I saw her, Belle, moving through the crowd, her white dress trailing behind her like something straight out of fairy tale. "Dad, you made it," she said, her voice bright, but her smile was tight, like it was painted on. I opened my mouth, ready to tell her how beautiful she looked, how proud I was of her. But before I could get a single word out, she kept going. "Listen, Mom," and I made a few adjustments, she said, her tone softer now, almost apologetic. "You're at the back table. It's just, we don't want to ruin the photos." Her words hit me harder than I expected, like a gut punch that knocked the wind clean out of me. The back table. I'd imagined myself sitting up front, watching her exchange vows, maybe even giving a toast. I'd pictured being part of it, not pushed off to the side like some distant relative. I stared at her for a moment, waiting for her to crack a smile, to tell me she was joking, but she didn't. Her eyes darted away, and she fidgeted with the lace on her sleeve. I swallowed the lump rising in my throat and gave her a small nod, forcing my voice to stay steady even though my chest felt like it was collapsing in on itself. "Sure, Belle. Whatever you need." She gave me a quick hug, barely a squeeze, before turning back to the crowd. Her veil fluttered as she disappeared into the sea of designer suits and glittering jewelry. And just like that, I was alone again. The noise of the room buzzed in my ears, but it felt distant, like I was underwater. The back table, probably near the kitchen, where the waitstaff would be rushing by and no one would notice me. I tugged at my tie, feeling the cheap fabric scratch against my neck. This wasn't how I'd pictured it. Not by a long shot. I'd spent years building her up, being there when she needed me most, and now I was an afterthought. A smudge they didn't want ruining their perfect picture. I glanced around, taking in the Thompsons' world, everything polished, expensive, and cold. Julian's parents stood near the bar, laughing a little too loud, their voices sharp and confident, like they owned the place. Maybe they did. I'd heard Julian's father owned half the real estate in the city, and his mother ran some high-profile charity that got her face plastered on magazine covers. And me? I was just the guy who worked double shifts to keep Belle in school, standing in a suit I bought off the rack because it was all I could afford after the divorce. Celeste had seen to that. My ex-wife had taken the house, the savings, and most of my pride, leaving me with just enough to keep going. I started toward the ballroom, each step heavier than the last, my shoes clicking softly against the marble. I didn't know exactly where that back table was, but I'd find it. I always found my place, didn't I? Even when it hurt. The air was thick with the scent of roses and champagne, and snippets of conversations floated around me. People talking about stocks and vacations, things I had no place in. I wondered if Belle had thought about me when she planned all this, or if Celeste had convinced her I didn't belong. Probably the latter. Celeste had a way of twisting things, making me out to be the bad guy, the failure. I shook my head, pushing the thought aside. This wasn't about me. This was Belle's day. I'd sit where they wanted me to sit, smile when they wanted me to smile. That's what dads do, right? But as I approached the ballroom doors, something shifted deep inside me. It wasn't just sadness anymore. It was something harder, sharper. I'd given everything to this family, to my daughter, and they'd tucked me away in the corner like I was nothing. My fists clenched at my sides, tension rippling through me. I wasn't going to make a scene. Not yet. But I wasn't going to let this slide, either. I'd figure something out. I always did. I knew how to play along, how to swallow my pride and do what was expected. For now, I'd take my seat at the back and watch from the sidelines. But deep down, I knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I was still standing near the ballroom doors, trying to shake off the sting of Belle's words when I saw her. Celeste. She moved through the crowd like she owned the damn place, her head held high, her heels clicking on the marble floor like tiny explosions. My ex-wife had always known how to make an entrance, and today was no exception. She was draped in a shimmering silver gown, the kind that probably cost more than my car. Her hair was piled high, elegant and perfect, like a crown perched on her head. And her chin? Tilted just enough to make sure everyone knew they were beneath her. She spotted me almost instantly, her eyes narrowing as she changed course and made a beeline in my direction. I braced myself, knowing whatever was coming wouldn't be good. It never was with her. "There you are," she said, stopping just a few feet away. Her voice was coated in that fake sweetness she'd perfected over the years, the kind that sounded pleasant enough but always hid a dagger underneath. "I was worried you'd show up in your thrift store best." Her gaze swept over my blue suit, her lips curling into a smile that felt like a knife twisting in my chest. I didn't say a word. I just stood there, letting her words linger between us. She'd always had a knack for pointing out what I didn't have, what I could never be, and today was no different. "Belle's photographer says we need symmetry," she continued, her tone breezy as she adjusted the diamond bracelet on her wrist, her movements slow and deliberate, like she was posing for a magazine cover. "Guests and designers. So please sit in the back." The sweetness was gone now, her words sharp and cold, cutting through the noise around us. I kept my face blank, refusing to give her the satisfaction of seeing how much it hurt. "Got it," I murmured, my voice low, barely above a whisper. She didn't even flinch. She just kept talking, piling it on like she always did. "Near the kitchen," she added, her eyes locking onto mine for a split second, a challenge daring me to argue. "They'll be serving staff meals at that table. Appropriate, don't you think?" And just like that, she turned on her heel and walked away, her dress swishing behind her, the sound of her heels fading into the hum of the crowd. I stood there for a moment, my heart pounding, but this time it wasn't sadness that filled me. It was something hotter, something that burned. Appropriate. The word lodged in my throat, bitter and heavy. She'd spent years tearing me down, making me feel small, and now she was doing it again, in front of everyone, on our daughter's wedding day. I unclenched my fists, not even realizing I'd been squeezing them so tight that my knuckles ached. The ballroom was filling up, people streaming past me, laughing and clinking glasses, completely unaware of the quiet little war Celeste had just waged. I could have followed her, said something, put her in her place, but what was the point? She'd just twist it, make me look like the bitter ex who couldn't let go. No, I wasn't giving her that. I took a slow, deep breath, forcing my shoulders to relax, and started walking toward the back of the room, near the kitchen, where she'd said, "Fine, I'd sit there. I'd eat whatever staff meal they shoved in front of me." But this wasn't over, not by a long shot. As I moved through the crowd, I could feel eyes on me. Not many, but enough. A couple of the Thompsons' friends glanced in my direction, their whispers barely hidden behind cupped hands. "That's him, isn't it?" one of the women murmured, her voice low but not low enough. "The dad? Doesn't look like much." I kept my head high, pretending I didn't hear. But it stung all the same. They didn't know me, didn't know what I'd sacrificed for Belle, what I'd given up so she could have this life. To them, I was just the guy in the cheap suit, the one who didn't fit in. And Celeste had made damn sure they saw me that way. I found a table exactly where I expected, tucked into a corner, right by the swinging kitchen doors. The chairs were plain, the tablecloth slightly wrinkled, a far cry from the elegant setups up front with their floral centerpieces and gold-rimmed plates. I sat down, the wood creaking beneath me, and watched as the waiters rushed past, their trays loaded with food that wouldn't be coming my way. The smell of roasted meat and garlic wafted out from the kitchen, mingling with the perfume and cologne of the guests nearby. I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms, trying to steady my thoughts. I could feel the anger simmering just beneath the surface, but I wasn't going to let it boil over. Not here. Not now. Instead, I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. My fingers hovered over the screen for a moment, hesitation creeping in. I never liked asking for help. Never had. But this wasn't about pride anymore. This was about showing them, all of them, that they couldn't shove me into a corner and pretend I didn't exist. Not like this. I scrolled through my contacts, my thumb hovering for a second before I found the name I needed. I tapped it. The line rang once, twice. Then a familiar voice answered. "Carlos, it's me," I said, keeping my voice low so no one around me would hear. "Remember when you said if I ever needed a favor?" I paused, swallowing hard. "I need one now." The line went quiet. I held my breath, waiting, my heart pounding in my ears. Then, after a beat, I heard it, that low, easy chuckle of his. "Consider done," he said. "No questions. No hesitation." I exhaled slowly, the tension bleeding out of my shoulders as I slipped the phone back into my pocket. A small smile tugged at the corner of my mouth. Celeste could shove me to the back all she wanted, but she didn't have a clue what was coming. Not yet. I sat there at that rickety table near the kitchen, the phone still warm in my hand from the call, my heart thumping a little harder than usual. Around me, the noise of the wedding buzzed, glasses clinking, people laughing, the faint hum of some elegant string quartet floating through the air. But none of it registered. All I could hear was Carlos's voice in my head, steady and sure. "Consider it done." I hadn't told him much, just that I needed a favor. And he didn't ask. That's the kind of man Carlos Sanchez was. He owned the entire Solaris hotel chain, a billionaire who rubbed elbows with presidents and CEOs. And yet, here I was, some guy in a cheap suit, calling him up like it was nothing. But it wasn't nothing. Not to me, and definitely not to him. I leaned back in my chair, the wood groaning under my weight, and let my mind drift back to how we'd even gotten here. 10 years ago, I'd been a different man. Not rich, not flashy, just a guy who knew how to build things. Back then, Carlos was just another dreamer with a big idea and no way to make it work. His tech platform, the one that eventually turned him into a household name, was a mess. The code was a disaster. The servers crashed every other day, and he was bleeding money trying to patch it together. I wasn't some hotshot programmer with a fancy degree, just a guy who'd taught himself how to make systems hum. But I saw the potential in what Carlos was building, and I spent months, nights, weekends, every spare minute, rewriting the backbone of his operation. I didn't ask for much in return, just a handshake and a thank you. He tried to pay me more, but I waved it off. "Someday, if I need something, I'll call," I told him. And Carlos had grinned, clapping me on the shoulder. "Anytime, my friend. Anytime." Now, here I was, finally cashing in that promise. And I'll be honest, I didn't feel great about it. Asking for help wasn't my style. I'd spent my whole damn life figuring things out on my own, scraping by after Celeste took everything in the divorce, keeping my head down while she built her little empire of appearances. But this? Sitting at the back of my own daughter's wedding, watching my ex-wife smirk like she'd won some twisted game I didn't even want to play, it was too much. I wasn't the type to shout or throw a fit. That wasn't who I was. But I also wasn't going to let them walk all over me. Not today. I glanced around the ballroom, taking it all in. The Thompsons were up front, holding court like royalty, their laughter loud and their smiles plastered on like they owned the place. Belle was off somewhere, probably fussing with her dress or posing for more of those perfect photos that didn't include me. And Celeste? She was floating through the crowd, shaking hands, laughing that sharp, hollow laugh of hers, the one that always made me feel like I was the punchline. The kitchen doors swung open behind me, and a waiter rushed past with a tray of shrimp or something fancy. The rich scent of butter and herbs drifted in the air, making my stomach growl. I ignored it. I wasn't here for the food. I was here for Belle, even if she didn't seem to want me around. My fingers tapped lightly against the table as I thought about Carlos and what he might do. I hadn't given him any details, just that I needed something to shake things up. He didn't know about Celeste or the Thompsons or how they'd shoved me to the back like I didn't belong. But he didn't need to. This hotel, it wasn't just a building. It was part of his empire, his brand. and I'd helped build the tech that kept that empire running. From the booking systems to the security cameras, everything was built on the foundation I'd laid down all those years ago. If anyone could turn this day upside down, it was Carlos. And Celeste? She wouldn't know what hit her. I didn't know exactly what Carlos was going to do, but I trusted him. He always had a flair for the dramatic, even back when he was just a guy with a laptop and a dream. The thought tugged a small smile out of me, despite everything. Celeste thought she had everything wrapped up tight. Her perfect wedding, her perfect daughter, her perfect new life where I didn't fit. But she didn't know about Carlos. She had no idea about the quiet work I'd done, the things I'd built that didn't come with a price tag or a spotlight. To her, I'd always be the loser, the guy who couldn't keep up with her big ambitions. And maybe I'd let her believe that for too long. Kept my head down, took the punches, but not anymore. Not today. I wasn't going to let her shove me into the shadows, not on a day that was supposed to mean something to me too. I shifted in my seat, feeling the cheap fabric of my suit tug at my shoulders. The table was still empty. No one else had been banished back here yet. Just me, the distant clatter of dishes being washed, and the occasional burst of kitchen noise leaking through the swinging doors. I could have stood up, walked out, left this whole mess behind, but I didn't. Belle was still my daughter, even if she'd hurt me. And this wedding, her wedding, was still mine to be part of, whether they liked it or not. I'd wait. I'd see what Carlos had up his sleeve. And when the time came, I'd stand up, not loud, not angry, just steady, because that's who I was. The guy who didn't break, even when they tried to push him out. I sat at that lonely table in the corner, the one Celeste had so kindly picked out for me, and watched the ballroom pulse with life. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and roasted chicken, and the chatter of the guests bounced off the high ceilings like a swarm of bees. Up front, the Thompsons were in their element. Julian's dad was slapping backs and laughing like he owned the place, and his mother was flashing that perfect magazine cover smile. Both of them soaking up the attention like this was their day instead of Belle's. I spotted Belle every now and then, flitting between tables, her white dress glowing under the chandeliers. But she never looked my way, not even once. I leaned back, letting the chair dig into my spine, my hands resting flat on the rough tablecloth. It felt cheap, scratchy, such a stark contrast to the silk and satin everywhere else. The crowd was a sea of $1,000 suits and gowns that glittered like they'd been dipped in diamonds. And me? I stuck out. I knew that. My blue suit wasn't much, just something I grabbed because it fit and didn't cost me a month's rent. But it was clean. It was mine. I caught a murmur from a few tables over. "That's him." The dad, a woman whispered, her voice low but not low enough. "The broke one." Her friend laughed, a quick, sharp sound that cut through me more than I'd like to admit. I kept my eyes forward, pretending I didn't hear. They weren't wrong. Not entirely. Celeste had taken most of what we had in the divorce, and I'd let her, thinking it would keep the peace for Belle's sake. But broke? That wasn't the whole story. They didn't know me. None of them did. And that made me smile. Just a little. Because I knew something they didn't. Carlos was out there somewhere, setting things in motion. I didn't know exactly what he was planning, but I could feel it, like the air shifting before storm. I'd asked for a favor, and he'd said yes. No questions, no hesitation. That's what real trust looked like. Years of quiet loyalty paying off with a single phone call. My foot tapped lightly under the table. I was restless but calm, waiting. The kitchen doors swung open behind me again, and a waiter rushed past with a tray of drinks. I caught a glimpse of the chaos in the kitchen. Pots clanging, voices shouting orders. It was louder back there, more real somehow. And then it started. At first, I barely noticed. Just one waiter slipping off his jacket and heading for the exit, his tray abandoned on a cart. I figured he was taking a break. But then, another one did the same. Folded his apron. Walked out without a word. My eyes narrowed, my body going still as I watched. Near the corner, the bartender started packing up his tools, tossing bottles into a crate like he was done for the night. One by one, the staff began peeling away. No fuss, no drama, just moving quietly toward the doors like they'd all gotten the same signal. The guests didn't notice at first. too wrapped up in their conversations and their cocktails to see what was happening around them. But I saw it. I felt it. Carlos had set something in motion. And Celeste? She had no idea what was coming. A few guests kept chatting, their voices loud and oblivious, but others were starting to notice. Heads turned, brows furrowed, and the murmurs grew louder. "Where's the waiter with the wine?" Someone called out, holding up an empty glass, their tone teetering between confusion and irritation. "Did they run out of hors d'oeuvres already?" Another voice chimed in, sounding more annoyed than concerned. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table, watching it all unfold like a movie I'd seen 100 times before. Only this time I knew the ending. The maitre d', a tall guy with a sharp jaw and a crisp black suit, the same one who'd been barking orders earlier, strode right through the center of the ballroom. His face was blank, unreadable, but his pace was deliberate. And without so much as a backward glance, he pushed open the front doors and walked out. That's when the panic started to ripple. A woman in a tight red dress stood up, craning her neck toward the kitchen. "What's happening?" she asked, loud enough to turn a few heads. The Thompsons stopped mid-conversation. Julian's dad froze, his smile dropping like he'd just bitten into something rotten. His eyes narrowed, scanning the room as if the problem was something he could spot and squash. I didn't move. I just sat there, hands clasped on the table, feeling the weight of it all settle in. This was Carlos. He pulled something big, bigger than anything I could have dreamed up myself. The air in the room felt different now, like the ground was shifting under everyone's feet, but I was the only one who wasn't surprised. Near the bar, a server, young, barely old enough to be pouring drinks, set down his tray, not with a loud crash, just a soft clatter of glass on wood. Then he peeled off his apron, folded it neatly, and walked out. One by one, they followed. A bartender packed up his tools, tossing bottles into a crate like he was clocking out for the night. Another waiter near the dance floor dropped his notepad, gave a quick glance around, and headed for the exit. No fuss, no noise, just quiet, efficient departures, like they'd all been given the same invisible signal. At first, the guests didn't catch on, too busy sipping champagne and talking about their stock portfolios. But slowly, confusion started to creep in. "Is this part of the wedding?" someone asked, half laughing, but there was no answer. My eyes found Celeste. She was still near the head table, her silver dress catching the light as she spun around, searching for someone, anyone, to snap at. I could see it, the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She wasn't in control anymore, and she knew it. That's what made this moment so damn sweet. It wasn't the chaos itself. It was the look in her eyes, the dawning realization that her perfect little world was slipping through her manicured fingers. I'd spent years letting her call the shots, letting her paint me as the failure. But now she was the one scrambling, and I was just sitting here, watching, waiting. The kitchen doors stopped swinging. No more trays, no more staff. The room felt emptier, even with all those people still packed inside. I could hear the Thompsons muttering now, Julian's mom whispering something sharp to her husband, her perfect smile gone, replaced by tight-lipped concern. Then I saw Belle. She appeared from the side, her white dress glowing under the chandeliers, but her face was pale, too pale. Her eyes darted around the room, wide and searching, like a child lost in a crowd. And for a second, I felt it, that pain. This was her day, her moment, and it was unraveling right in front of her. But the sympathy didn't last long. She'd chosen this, chosen them over me. And now she was seeing what that choice really looked like. I smiled again, bigger this time. I leaned back in my chair, feeling the tension ease just a little as I let the chaos unfold around me. The ballroom was turning into a mess of confusion. The staff was gone, waiters, bartenders, even a guy who'd been wiping down tables. All of them had vanished like they'd rehearsed it. The fancy guests, draped in their glittering gowns and tailored suits, were starting to squirm now. Their voices were louder, sharper, as they waved empty glasses and craned their necks, looking for someone, anyone, to fix it. The air was getting heavy, thick with uncertainty. like everyone was holding their breath, waiting for an explanation that wasn't coming. My hand stayed steady on the table, but my heart was pounding harder now. Not from nerves. No, this was something else. Something like satisfaction. And then, what's going on? Celeste's voice sliced through the noise like a whip. She spun around, her silver dress flashing under the lights, her tone sharp and demanding. She was looking for a waiter, a manager, anyone to bark at. But there was no one left to answer her. Her face was tight, her lips pressed into a thin line, and I could see it clear as day. She was unraveling. She hated not being in charge. Always had. I didn't move. Didn't say a word. Just watched her flail, her world crumbling while I sat quietly in the shadows. The Thompsons were on their feet now, too. Julian's dad was muttering something to his wife, his big shoulders hunched like he was ready to storm the kitchen himself. And Belle, she was still standing off to the side, her hands twisting nervously in her veil, her eyes darting from face to face, looking for someone to tell her what to do. I felt a pang again. This wasn't how I'd imagined her day. But that pang faded just as fast. She'd made her choice, and choices had consequences. Then the doors swung open, and there he was, Carlos Sanchez. He strode in like he owned the place, which technically he did. I guess he did. And he wasn't alone. Two men in dark suits flanked Carlos, their faces unreadable, their steps sure and steady, like they were ready for anything. They moved with quiet confidence, the kind that made people notice. The room went still for a beat, the air thick with anticipation. Then the whispers started up again, louder this time, rippling through the crowd like a wave. Carlos wasn't just a man who ran hotels. Anyone who read a newspaper or scrolled through their phone knew that. He built empires, gave keynote speeches at conferences where the ticket price was more than I made in a month, donated millions to schools and hospitals like it was pocket change. And now, here he was, walking into my daughter's wedding. His eyes scanned the crowd, sharp and deliberate, until they landed on me. I straightened up, feeling the weight of his gaze. "Apologies," Carlos said, his voice smooth, calm, and just loud enough to cut through the murmurs. "Due to internal policy violations regarding the treatment of one of our partners, we are ceasing service. Effective immediately." He didn't shout, didn't need to. Every word hit like a stone dropping into still water, sending shockwaves through the room. The guests froze, some with glasses halfway to their lips, others clutching their purses like they weren't sure whether to stay or bolt. "Policy violations?" A man near the bar muttered, his brow furrowed. "What the hell does that mean?" But Carlos wasn't done. He shifted slightly, just enough to angle himself toward Celeste. Then, as if he was delivering a final verdict, he looked back at me. And that's when I saw it, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Partner." Celeste's voice cut through the silence, sharp and high-pitched, almost frantic. "Partner," she echoed, her heels clicking as she took a step forward. Her eyes darted between Carlos and me, her mind working overtime, trying to piece it together. I could see the gears turning, the disbelief crawling across her face. She didn't get it. Not yet. But the rest of the room was starting to. Gasps popped up here and there, little bursts of noise as people leaned closer to each other, whispering, their curiosity crackling in the air. Carlos didn't flinch. He just kept that calm, steady look on his face and said, "This man helped build the architecture that runs my global platform. I owe my empire to him." He nodded toward me, and just like that, every head in the room turned my way. I didn't move. Not at first. I just sat there, letting it all sink in. The air felt different now, charged and humming, like everyone was seeing me for the first time. I could hear the Thompsons whispering, Julian's mom clutching her necklace like it might protect her from whatever was happening. Belle stood off to the side, her mouth slightly open, her hands falling limp at her sides. And Celeste. She looked like she'd been slapped. Her face went red, then white, then red again. I stood up slowly, brushing my hands down the front of my suit, feeling the familiar texture of the fabric beneath my fingers. It was cheap. It wasn't designer. But for the first time, it didn't feel like a mark of shame. It felt like a badge, something I'd earned. All those years of Celeste calling me a failure, painting me as a nobody, as the man who couldn't keep up with her perfect little world. And now, here was Carlos Sanchez, telling the world that I had built something bigger than Celeste could have ever dreamed of. The gasps kept coming. Champagne glasses hovered midair, forgotten as people stared. I didn't say anything. Not yet. I didn't have to. Carlos had said enough. The truth was out now, hanging over the room like thick smoke, impossible to ignore. I'd helped Carlos build the systems that powered his empire. The booking platforms, the security, the foundation of it all. No spotlight, no fancy title, just quiet work. The kind I'd always done, and Carlos had never forgotten it. Our eyes met across the room, and he gave me a nod, short and sharp, the same way he used to back when we were just two guys figuring things out in a cramped office 10 years ago. Celeste took another step toward me, her heels clicking a little harder this time. "This is ridiculous," she snapped, but her voice wobbled. And no one was listening to her anymore. The guests were too busy looking at me, some with curiosity, others with something else. Respect. I didn't care about them. Not really. This wasn't about their approval. This was about her. About Belle. About the life they'd all tried to erase me from. I stood there, shoulders square, feeling taller than I had in years. The walkout was over. But the quake? The quake was just beginning. And I was standing right at the epicenter. The weight of Carlos's words still hung heavy over the ballroom, settling like a thick fog. My blue suit, the one Celeste had sneered at, suddenly felt different, like a second skin I'd grown into. The room was a mess of stunned faces, guests clutching their drinks, whispers buzzing through the air, bouncing between me and Carlos like no one could decide who to watch. Celeste stood frozen near the head table, her silver dress catching the light, but doing nothing to hide the storm brewing behind her eyes. Her world was crumbling, and for once, she couldn't stop it. I hadn't seen it in years. Panic. Celeste had built her entire world on control, on making me the nobody while she crafted her perfect image. And now, it was all crumbling, right in front of everyone. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just stood there, letting it all sink in, feeling the ground steady beneath my feet for the first time that day. Carlos was still by the doors, his dark suit sharp against the pristine white walls. His two guys stood like statues behind him, their eyes scanning the room with that quiet readiness that made people nervous without them saying a word. The silence Carlos had dropped over the ballroom didn't last long. The murmurs started up again, louder now, as the guests struggled to make sense of what they'd just heard. He built his empire? The question came from a guy in a tux, leaning toward his wife. His voice was low, but not low enough. What does that even mean? I could have answered. I could have told them about the late nights, the endless lines of code, and the way I'd patched together Carlos's dream when it was nothing but a shaky idea. But I didn't, because that wasn't the point. The point was, they were looking at me now, really looking, and not as the guy stuck at the back table. I took a step forward, my shoes barely making a sound on the marble floor, and cleared my throat. "The wedding can continue," I said, my voice steady and loud enough to carry. "If my daughter and her fiancé still want it." I let the words hang for a second, but under new terms, new management. I paused, letting that last part settle before adding, "and a new seating chart." I didn't need to raise my voice. I didn't have to. The room was hanging on every word. I could feel their eyes on me, their surprise rippling through the crowd like I just flipped the script they'd all written for me. Belle's gaze met mine from across the room. Her hands were twisting in her veil again, her lips parted like she wanted to say something but couldn't quite find the words. Julian stood beside her, his face pale, his jaw clenched tight like he was trying to decide if I was a threat or just another complication he hadn't planned for. Carlos didn't miss a beat. He turned to his men, his voice calm and cool, like he was ordering a cup of coffee. "Bring in our staff." The doors swung open again. A new crew entered, moving with quiet purpose. Servers in crisp black uniforms flowed into the room like they'd been waiting for this moment. Their movements were quick, practiced, efficient. They carried silver trays loaded with food and drinks, and their confidence made the old staff look like amateurs. The guests watched, some easing back into their seats, others still standing, unsure what to do next. The air shifted. Less chaos. more curiosity. A woman near me set her glass down, her eyebrows raised like she was watching a show she hadn't bought tickets for. One of the new servers approached my table, the back table, and set down a plate of food. The smell hit me first. Roasted meat, herbs, something rich and decadent. Definitely not the lukewarm staff meal Celeste had promised me. He didn't say a word, just gave me a nod and moved on. Then another man approached. Young, sharp-eyed. Sir, he said quietly, with a polite confidence. Your new seats. This way. I stood, feeling the weight of every eye in the room following me as I walked. Past the rows of tables, past the whispers, straight to the front of the room. The head table, the place where Belle and Julian were supposed to sit. The server pulled out a chair, fancy, cushioned, nothing like the creaky one I'd been stuck in, and I sat down, my hands resting on the smooth tablecloth. It felt strange, being up here, but it felt right too. Celeste was still standing, her face flushed, her hands clenched so tight at her sides that her knuckles had gone white. This is absurd, she hissed, her voice sharp and loud enough for the people nearby to hear. But this time, no one jumped to her defense. The Thompsons were watching. Julian's dad stood with his arms crossed, his jaw tight, while his mother clutched her purse like it might bolt if she let go. Carlos's team didn't care. Another server approached Celeste, his expression polite but firm. Ma'am, he said, gesturing toward the table I'd just left. Your seat is over there. He pointed toward the back, near the kitchen, where I had been. Celeste's eyes widened, her face paling as realization set in. Then her expression hardened, her lips pressing into a thin, furious line. For a second, I thought she might argue, but she didn't. She turned, her heels stabbing into the marble with each step as she marched back toward the corner. When she reached the table, she sat down hard, the chair scraping against the floor loud enough to make a few heads turn. I didn't look at her. I didn't have to. I glanced around the head table instead. Belle and Julian were still standing off to the side, whispering to each other, their eyes darting between me and the rest of the room. The new staff moved like clockwork, setting plates in front of the Thompsons, pouring wine, smoothing out the wrinkles the walkout had left. The guests were starting to settle now, some digging into the food, others still sneaking glances my way, like they were waiting for me to make another move. I didn't. I just sat there, letting the moment breathe, feeling the weight of it, because this wasn't about ruining anything. This was about reclaiming everything. This wasn't just about fixing what had been broken. It was about rewriting it, putting me back where I belonged, not in the shadows, not near the kitchen, here, at my daughter's wedding, where I'd earned a place. Carlos caught my eye from across the room. One last nod, short and simple, before he turned to leave. He didn't need to stay. His work was done. The ballroom was alive again, the clatter of forks and glasses picking up, the chatter flowing like nothing had happened. But everything had happened. I picked up my fork, the cool metal resting comfortably in my hand, and took a bite. Damn, it was good. And for the first time all day, I felt like I could breathe. Celeste could glare all she wanted from her new spot near the kitchen. Her back straight, her lips pressed so tight they were almost white. But this wasn't her show anymore. I sat at the head table, the fancy chair firm under me, a plate of food steaming with flavors I hadn't expected to taste today. Not after Celeste's promise of staff meals and back tables. But here I was, and I belonged. The new staff moved smoothly through the room, pouring wine and clearing plates with quiet efficiency, like nothing had changed. But everything had. Carlos had flipped the whole damn script with one phone call. And now I was here, watching Belle and Julian whispering off to the side. Their faces were tight, their conversation too quiet to hear, but I could see the weight of it in their expressions. The Thompsons were eating now. Julian's dad kept glancing my way, his fork hovering mid-air, like he was still trying to figure out what to make of me. I didn't care about him. Not really. My eyes were on my daughter, Belle. She broke away from Julian after a minute, her white dress swishing as she moved. Slow at first, then faster, like she'd made up her mind about something. Her veil was crooked now, her makeup smudged beneath her eyes where tears had started to gather. She stopped a few feet away from me, her hands twisting together, her eyes uncertain. And for the first time in a long time, she looked at me like she was really seeing me. "Dad," she started, her voice soft, shaky. I didn't know." Her words wavered, her lips pressing together like she was trying to hold back the weight of everything crashing down on her. "I thought you were just—" She trailed off, biting her lip. I could see it, the pieces coming together in her mind. Years of half-truths and lies she'd swallowed without question. "Just what, Belle?" I asked gently, my voice low but steady. I set my fork down and gave her my full attention, waiting. Her eyes dropped to the floor for a moment, then back to me, her gaze full of regret. "Mom always said," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. "She said you were the poor one." I felt that, right in my chest. I thought. Her eyes darted around the ballroom, taking in the chandeliers, the polished silver, the glittering crowd. "I thought you didn't care about all this. About appearances. About fitting in." She waved a hand toward the room, her expression torn between confusion and shame. Her words didn't sting because they were cruel. They stung because they were honest. That's what Celeste had fed her, year after year, painting me as the man who didn't measure up, the one who didn't belong. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table, my hands clasped together. "I don't care about appearances, Belle," I said softly, my voice steady. "Never have." I let the words settle, watching her face shift, confusion giving way to something softer. "Regret. But I do care about dignity." I paused, letting her feel the weight of that truth. I didn't build what I built for Carlos to show off. I did it because it mattered, because it helped people. My throat tightened, but I pushed through it. "And I didn't raise you to see me as some shadow in the back." Her lip trembled, and she blinked fast, but the tears still spilled over. She took a shaky step closer. I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. Her words hit harder than I expected. "I didn't mean to hurt you," she said, her eyes dropping to the floor again. "I was just trying to fit in, to make Mom happy, to make Julian's family happy." Her voice cracked, and she shook her head, her frustration and guilt spilling out in a flood of emotions she didn't know how to contain. I didn't think. She stopped, because there weren't words for what she was feeling, and I didn't push. I just nodded, letting her feel it. The ache in my chest eased just a little. She wasn't a kid anymore, but she was still mine, and I could see her trying to figure out what that meant now. Then Julian stepped up beside her, his hands tucked into his pockets, his face serious but not hard. He was a good-looking kid, tall, dark hair, the kind of guy who fit perfectly into this world of money and polish. But he didn't look smug now, not like his parents sometimes did. "Sir," he started, his voice low and respectful. "I apologize," he said, his tone steady. "I never meant to disrespect you. I didn't know." He glanced at Belle, then back at me, like he was waiting for me to judge him. But I didn't. He wasn't the one who'd shoved me to the back table. That was Celeste's doing. Maybe Belle's too, but not his. I looked at Julian first, then back at Belle. Their faces were tight with uncertainty, but there was something else there now. Understanding. I leaned back in my chair, letting the weight of it settle. "Today's still yours," I said, my voice calm but firm. "If you want it to be." I glanced at Belle, holding her gaze. "I'm not here to stop it," I continued, my tone steady. "But I'm not going to be a ghost at my own daughter's wedding. Not anymore." I meant it. This wasn't about revenge. Not really. It was about being seen. About taking back the place they tried to erase me from. Belle nodded, her eyes still glistening, but her hands were steadier now as she wiped away the last of her tears. Julian placed a hand gently on her shoulder, giving me a small, respectful nod. They didn't say anything else. They didn't need to. They just turned and walked back to their spot, talking quietly, figuring out what came next. The room kept moving around me. Guests eating, laughing, the new staff keeping everything running smooth. Like nothing had happened. But everything had happened. I picked up my fork again, the cool metal grounding me, and took another bite. The flavors were rich, warm, comforting in a way I hadn't expected. Up front, I could see Celeste, still sitting by the kitchen doors. Her back stiff, her face turned away like she couldn't stand to look at me. Good. Let her sit there. She'd spent years trying to erase me from Belle's life, from this family. And now, she was the one on the outside looking in. I didn't need to yell, didn't need to point fingers. Carlos had done the heavy lifting. All I had to do was stand up when it mattered. A few people started drifting toward me after that. First, some guy in a sleek suit who said he'd heard of Carlos's platform. Then a woman with a glass of champagne who asked if I'd really built it from scratch. I kept my answers short. No bragging. Just stating facts. Yeah, I helped him get it going, I'd say. And they'd nod, impressed, before moving on to spread the word. I didn't need their praise. I hadn't done it for that. But it felt good, sitting here, knowing Belle was finally seeing me. Not as the shadow her mom had painted, but as her father. And that was enough. I sat there, at the head table, the noise of the wedding swirling around me like a storm that had finally started to settle. Forks clinking, voices overlapping. The new staff weaving through the crowd, their silver trays balanced with the grace of professionals who knew how to handle chaos. The food in front of me was still warm. The meat tender, the sauce rich. But I wasn't eating much anymore. Just pushing it around with my fork, letting the moment sink in. Belle and Julian were back at their table now, talking quietly with a few guests. Her tears were gone, but I could still see the weight in her eyes. Julian's hand rested gently on her arm, his expression softer now. He was watching her, not the crowd. The Thompsons? They were quieter now, picking at their plates, the earlier swagger gone. And Celeste. She was still back near the kitchen. Her silver dress was a bright spot against the dull corner, but her face was pale under all that makeup. She kept her head turned away, as if ignoring me might make all this disappear. I didn't look at her for long. She didn't deserve my attention. The room was different now, less tense, more curious. People kept glancing my way, some whispering, others just staring, trying to figure me out. I'd gone from the guy shoved to the back, to the man they couldn't stop watching, all because Carlos had opened his mouth and told them the truth. I hadn't asked for it, hadn't planned it, but here it was unfolding right in front of me. A man in a dark suit approached my table, his tie loose, his glass of wine half empty. He leaned in, his voice low but eager. "You're the one who built Sanchez's platform?" he asked, like he couldn't quite believe it. I nodded, keeping it simple. "Yeah," I said. "I helped him out a while back." His eyebrows shot up, and he let out a soft whistle before walking off, already telling the guy next to him what I'd said. Then a woman came over, older, pearls around her neck, her smile warm and real. "I heard you worked on the back-end systems," she said, sitting down across from me like we were old friends. "My son's in tech. He'd love to hear about this." I shrugged, unsure what to say. It would just work, I told her. Fix some problems. Make it run smooth. That's all. She laughed, like I'd said something funny, and patted my hand before heading back to her table. More people followed. A businessman with a firm handshake and too much cologne. A younger woman who said she'd studied Carlos's company in school. I kept my answers short. Not because I didn't want to talk, but because I didn't need to explain myself anymore. The work spoke for itself. I glanced toward Celeste again, just for a second. She was sitting stiff as a board, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her face pale and tight with barely contained fury. She wasn't shrinking, not yet, but she was close. And for once, I didn't feel small. I felt whole, and I could see it, in the way Celeste wouldn't look at me, wouldn't look at anyone. The world she'd built, the lies she'd spun, the years of telling everyone I was nothing, was crumbling, and she couldn't stop it. I didn't feel sorry for her, not after everything, but I didn't feel happy either, because this wasn't about her. Not really. This was about me, about Belle, about the truth finally getting some air. Then I saw Julian's father making his way over. Slow, like he wasn't sure he wanted to be here. He was a big guy, broad shoulders, gray hair, and the kind of presence that made people pay attention. The kind of man who looked like he'd never lost a fight. He stopped a few feet away from me, his hands tucked into his pockets, his eyes giving me a slow, appraising look. "I'd heard of a man who built the back-end infrastructure for the UN's health network," he said, his voice gruff but not unkind. Never imagined he'd be wearing an off-the-rack suit. He paused after that, like he was waiting for me to defend myself. But I didn't. I just met his gaze, steady and sure. Character isn't sewn into a label, I said quietly. His eyes flickered, and then he blinked. A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Fair enough, he murmured. And just like that, he nodded and walked away, leaving me with that small but satisfying win. I leaned back in my chair, feeling the cushion press against my back, and took a slow sip of water. Cool, sharp, grounding. The room kept moving. Guests eating, talking, laughing now. The new staff keeping it all together like they'd been there the whole time. A senator I vaguely recognized came by next, shaking my hand and saying something about a mentorship program I'd funded years ago. Didn't know that was you, he said, clapping my shoulder with a little too much enthusiasm. Good work. I nodded, thanked him, and let him go. It was strange, all these people suddenly seeing me. But that wasn't why I'd done any of it. Not the coding, not the helping, none of it. I just wanted to build something solid, something that lasted. And now, Belle was watching me. I could feel it. She was still with Julian, but her eyes kept flicking my way, her expression soft and searching, like she was piecing me together all over again. I didn't wave her over, didn't call her name. I didn't have to. She'd come when she was ready. For now, I just sat there, letting the unveiling happen, letting the room rewrite me, from the broke dad in the cheap suit to the man who had built something real. It wasn't loud, wasn't flashy, but it was mine. And for the first time in years, I felt like I fit. Not because of where I was sitting, but because of who I was. The food was cold now, but I didn't care. I'd won something bigger than a meal. I sat at the head table, the noise of the wedding settling into a steady hum around me. Glasses clinking, voices blending, the new staff moving like shadows to keep everything smooth. The plate in front of me was mostly empty, just a few scraps of meat and a smear of sauce left. But I wasn't hungry anymore. The air felt lighter, like the tension from earlier had burned off, leaving something softer in its place. The lights dimmed a little, and the music shifted, strings fading out, replaced by a slow, warm beat. The first dance. I leaned back, watching as Julian led Belle to the center of the room. Her white dress glowed under the chandeliers, her hands resting in his as he held her close. The moment everyone had been waiting for. I didn't move. I just watched them sway together, her head tilted against his shoulder, his arm firm around her waist. They looked good, happy even, and for a moment, I let myself feel that old ache, the one that came with knowing she wasn't my little girl anymore. She was theirs now, his, the Thompsons, this whole shiny world I'd never fit into. But then, Belle glanced my way, just a quick look, over Julian's shoulder, and I saw it, something soft, something sorry. I didn't smile, didn't wave. I just held her gaze, letting her see me, until she turned back to him. She'd come to me when she was ready. I knew that now. The song ended, and the crowd clapped. Polite at first, then louder, a few whistles cutting through the applause. Julian kissed her forehead, and they stepped apart as other couples filtered onto the dance floor. I stayed where I was, my hands resting on the table, feeling the smooth wood under my fingertips. The room was alive again. Laughter, chatter, the rustle of dresses as people moved. But out of the corner of my eye, I could still see her, Celeste, still by the kitchen, her silver dress catching the light. But her face? Dark, closed off. Good. Let her sit in the corner, where she tried to put me. She hadn't moved much since they'd stuck her there, and I didn't care enough to check if she was watching, because this wasn't about her. Not anymore. Then I saw Belle, walking toward me again. Her steps were quicker this time, more sure of herself. She stopped right in front of my chair, her hands clasped tight, her veil pushed back so I could see her face clear. Red eyes, smudged makeup, but steady now. Dad, she said, her voice quiet but firm. I'm sorry. For everything. Her fingers twisted together, her knuckles white, and I could see how much it cost her to say it. I was trying to fit into their world, she whispered, her words tumbling out like she'd been holding them in too long. Mom's world. Julian's family. Her throat bobbed as she swallowed hard. I forgot who raised me. The words hung there, heavy and raw, sinking into me like stones dropping into deep water. I didn't answer right away. I just looked at her, letting her feel it. I pushed my chair back slowly, the legs scraping against the floor as I stood. My suit pulled tight across my shoulders, but I barely noticed. "You don't have to explain," I said softly, my voice just for her. "I get it." Her eyes darted up to meet mine, searching. "You got caught up in all this?" I murmured, glancing around the room. The chandeliers, the fancy crowds spinning around us. "But I'm still here, Belle." I met her gaze again, holding it steady. "I've always been here." Her breath hitched, her eyes blinking fast as tears welled up again. But this time, she didn't let them fall. Instead, she stepped closer, reached for my hand. Her fingers were cold, but her grip was firm. I squeezed back. Not hard, just enough to let her know, "I'm in it." "I didn't see you," she whispered, her voice barely above the music. "Not really." Her lip trembled, but she kept going. "Mom made it sound like you didn't care, like you were just gone." Her voice cracked, and she shook her head, anger and regret fighting for space on her face. "But you're not." Her eyes locked on mine, her voice stronger now. "You never were." I didn't say a word about Celeste. Didn't need to. Belle was figuring it out on her own, and that was enough. I let go of her hand and gave her a small nod, just once, telling her it was okay, without words. She didn't need me to yell or point fingers. She just needed me to be here, steady, like always. The music picked up again, faster now, and more people crowded the dance floor. Julian's parents, a few cousins, some drunk uncles stumbling through the steps. But Belle stayed close, hovering near me, like she wasn't quite ready to go back. And then Carlos appeared, weaving through the crowd with that easy, confident stride of his, a glass of something dark in his hand. He stopped a few feet away, raised it slightly, and said, "To the man who chose silence over ego." His voice was smooth, calm, but it carried, and dignity over display. His eyes met mine, steady and knowing. "You showed us all what true power looks like." The room shifted. A few heads turned, guests, staff, catching his words. Even Julian's mom looked over, her expression tight, like she'd just swallowed a lemon. The room clapped, some hesitant, some strong. Carlos grinned, took a sip, and disappeared back into the crowd. I didn't say anything, just sat back down, feeling the weight of his words settle over me. Belle sat too, pulling her chair close. For a while, we just watched, her beside me, quiet, her hand resting near mine on the table. The dancing went on. The lights spun. The night stretched out. I didn't need to do more. I'd said what I needed to, stood where I needed to. This was her day still, but it was mine too, in a way I hadn't expected. And that was the truth of it. Laid bare on the dance floor. No shouting required. I woke up the next morning in my small apartment. The sun was sneaking through the blinds, hitting my face, pulling me out of a sleep that hadn't been deep, but had been enough. The bed creaked under me as I shifted. My blue suit was crumpled in a heap on the chair where I'd tossed it last night. The wedding felt like a dream now, fuzzy around the edges, but sharp in the middle. Every moment burned into my head. I rubbed my eyes, feeling the ache in my shoulders from sitting so long, from standing so tall when it mattered. The clock on the nightstand blinked back at me. Just past 8. The quiet was a relief after the noise of the Grand Solaris. The clinking glasses, the chatter, the music that just wouldn't stop. I lay there for a minute, staring at the ceiling, letting it all settle. Then, my phone buzzed on the nightstand. A short, sharp vibration that pulled me out of my thoughts. I reached for it, squinting at the screen. A message from Carlos. "Staff are still talking about you. You a legend." I read it twice, letting the words sink in. And then, a smile crept onto my face. Not big, just enough to feel real. Legend. Me. The guy in the cheap suit. The one Celeste had shoved to the back. The one Belle hadn't seen until it was almost too late. I set the phone down and leaned back against the headboard, my hands resting on my knees. It wasn't about the staff talking. Not really. It was about what it meant that I'd stood up, quiet but sure, and they'd noticed. I swung my legs over the edge of the bed, my bare feet meeting the cold wood floor. The chill jolted me awake a little more as I shuffled to the kitchen. The coffee machine hissed and gurgled as it came to life, filling the air with that familiar, grounding smell. I stood there, hands resting on the counter, letting the scent settle around me as my mind drifted back to last night. Belle, sitting beside me after the dance, her hand close to mine, her words soft, but heavy with years of unspoken things. She'd seen me, finally, not as the shadow her mom had painted, but as the man who had raised her, the man who had built something worth noticing. Julian had nodded at me before they left, a quiet respect in his eyes, and even the Thompsons, their usual loudness had been dialed down. They'd kept their distance. It wasn't a big win, not the kind you see in movies, but it was a shift, a crack in the wall they'd built around me. The coffee was ready. I poured into my favorite chipped mug, the heat warming my hands as I stood by the window. Outside, the street was still waking up. Just a few cars parked along the curb. Empty sidewalks. Quiet. I took a sip, the bitterness sharp on my tongue, and let my mind wander back to that moment, when Carlos raised his glass. Dignity over display. The words have been rolling around in my head ever since. Like a stone I couldn't put down. I'd never been loud. Never needed to be. I built things. Fixed things. Kept going when Celeste took everything and left me with scraps. And last night, I hadn't shouted. Hadn't thrown a punch. I just made a call. Stood my ground. And let the truth do the rest. I didn't care about embarrassing Celeste, though I knew she'd felt it, sitting by the kitchen doors, her perfect world cracking. But that wasn't why I'd done it. And it wasn't about revenge, either. Not the kind that leaves you hollow afterward. No, it was about stepping into the light. After years of letting them shove me into the dark. Years of carrying labels like less than. Simple. Just the ex-husband. Sticking to me like mud I couldn't wash off. I'd carried that weight too long. Kept my head down, thinking it was better for Belle if I didn't fight back. But last night, I shed it, piece by piece, until I was just me again. Raw, real, standing where I belonged. My phone buzzed again. I walked back to the nightstand, setting my mug down as I picked it up. Belle, Dad, thank you for everything. Can we talk soon? I stared at the screen for a moment. My chest tightened, but not with hurt, with something warm, something I hadn't felt in a long time. I typed back, my fingers steady. Anytime, kid. I'm here. I hit send, and for the first time in years, I felt lighter. She wasn't gone. Not to me. Not anymore. We'd figured out, one step at a time, and that was enough. I finished my coffee, the mug empty now, and rinsed it in the sink. The water was cold against my fingers. The day stretched out ahead of me. Nothing big planned. Just a quiet Saturday. Maybe a walk. Maybe some tinkering on the old laptop. I still like to mess around with code now and then. But it felt different now. Like I turned a corner I didn't even know I was heading for. I wasn't a legend because people said so. I was a legend because I'd chosen to be, in my own way, without shouting, without begging for it. One quiet call, just like Carlos said, and the world had listened. Not because I demanded it, but because I'd earned it. I grabbed my jacket, not the suit, just an old one that fit, and I stepped outside. The air was crisp and clean, the kind that filled your lungs and cleared your head. The street was waking up now, a dog barking somewhere, a car starting down the block. I walked, hands in my pockets, feeling the ground solid beneath my feet. This was my life. Simple, steady, mine. And after last night, no one could take that from me again.